Starting from this lecture, we're going to explore a series of topics related to spatial analysis, or we call it GIS analysis. We're going to follow this framework that set by a textbook of Mitchell, who has written this very nice book called GIS Analysis. Mapping where things are is closely related to the analytical reasoning with geospatial data. The reason we map where things are can be many. For example, the analysis need to look at the overall pattern of the distribution and see where the things are clustered and closed. And the other case, maybe we want to compare two area or two things in terms of location and density and other attributes. Okay? Third case, maybe we want to situate an understanding of one thing or one feature in the context of other features. So these are all possible kind of reasons for us to visualize features based on their location. When we talk about map where things are, we mainly talk about mapping individual. We spend efforts mapping individual trees so that we can see the overall forest pattern. We will also be able to find the individual features that we are interested in based on location, based on place. We could also present this to humans for their understanding. For example, the map with the right shows very clearly that one area has more crime and the other area has fewer crime. So that will attract human attention to decide what to do with the different observed pattern. The first step for us to make sense of any geospatial data is to find out where things are. And for example, if you're interested to study crime patterns, the first thing you want to find out is where crime has happened. And if you want to study earthquake, you want to know what is the historical occurrence of earthquake over different places. In order to depict things on the map as where they are, normally we follow several steps. One thing we want to decide is what information we need to put on the map. In this case, we talk about the themes, and themes could be either the focus theme, the most important themes, and some other themes may be placed in as well because they provide the necessary context for interpreting or relating to the main theme. And then we decide how to present the map, how to compose the map, meaningful fashion, and have the related context. And last, we want to say something about the patterns that show up when all the features, all the occurrences are mapped in the space, whether they're clustered, whether they are sparse, or whether there's any significant patterns we can observe. The next decision is to determine what kind of information we need to put on the map. This will be decided by the information need of the analysis. For example, if our goal of analysis is to simply understand the general distribution of crime pattern, then the map on the left will be sufficient. However, if our question is to study whether certain kind of crimes tend to distribute more from one place to another, then we will have to differentiate different kind of crimes and map them in different color or symbol. And that's necessary based on the nature of the analysis. Another factor will affect your selection of information to put in a map is to consider the audience and also how the audience are going to use your map. For example, when you have a map, you can map them by categories, okay? But what about if they have two ways to categorize things? One way is a very detailed category, the other way is a very kind of gross categorization. So which one will be a better way to show? Well, that depends, okay? So in the slides, we see there's two maps. And the map on the left is more appropriate for professionals because they actually show more detailed categories of land use. For the map on the right, it shows only 5 different categories, which is probably enough for a city government to communicate their plans to the public to discuss general zoning plans. So these 2 maps are actually used for different kind of audience and for different purpose. After deciding on what information you put on your map, then you start a process of searching and looking for the right data to include in your map. You may find the situation where the data sets are not exactly what you need. One case that the data may have more than you need. For example, you're interested at a map of crime in your locality, but you find the data sets that cover the whole city. In that case, you may have to select a subset based on location. Okay. Other cases may be that the data has so much attributes but you only need a few, and then you can actually query based on the attributes value. So you may only be interested in certain kind of crime rather than all the crime. You may want to just focus on the commercial crime. So that's also involved in selection. Some of the query capability built into ArcGIS are designed to help you to do filtering and selection. One of the functions we're going to learn in ArcGIS is called a definition query, where you can define a filter when you include a map layer into your project. There may be other reasons you have to do some data preparation before you put them on your map. For example, the data you get may not have the right categorization of the features. That means maybe the features are not in the granularity of the categorization that you need, or they may not be coded in the right term. So in both cases, we need to recode or recategorize the data so that the map can be more meaningful to the purpose of the use. In the example given, we have shown that the same crime data can be viewed by very different way of categorization. One way is to differentiate commercial from residential, and the other way to categorize is to differentiate the way that the criminals enter the scene. Preparing the data into the right and meaningful categories may involve 2 things. One is that if there's no category has been assigned to features, you may have to create a new attributes that record those categories as new attributes so that you can use it to map those features. The second case is that you already have some categories. Possibility is that you can aggregate some of those categories into the meaningful categories that you're trying to create. For example, on the map shown on the left, we have the features actually mapped to a number of small categories. But in fact, what you need is to map features into 5 broad categories. In this case, what we need to do is to add the new category information, and based on the refined categories, we can assign them to this new category. So it's really about the category grouping. Mapping categorical data means you want to represent each category in the meaningful symbols and colors. So choosing the right symbol to closely match the meaning of that category is the most important thing. That's why in ArcGIS we have a large selection of symbology where you can choose from different categories, for example, transportation, crisis management, civil applications, and etc. So please pay attention to those symbol types that may be closely matched to the commonly used data category. When you have multiple categories to display on your map, there's a few strategies. Here we show the strategies that are discussed in the textbook of Mitchell's textbook, GIS Analysis. And on the top, we have one strategy is to use color to differentiate the different category of crime, but the symbol is the same. They all use circles. And the second map on the right shows that you can use the symbol type, different shapes of symbols, to represent different categories. In this case, the color is the same, but is the symbol used different shapes. And the third choice is to map each kind of category as a separate map, where you show different kind of crime in the separate wheel. So, for example, in ArcGIS, we can make multiple data frames, and you can actually make 4 frames in this case. Each shows the one kind of crime. So that's another choice. The purpose of visualizing features and categories are for the interpreting and making sense of the patterns and associations among those. So one of the things that we want to do after presenting the features as a map is to interpret the patterns. If the map have many features classes, we may want to interpret the map in several different steps. First, we can interpret individual feature classes. For example, we can interpret the different kind of crimes and look at how individual crime patterns are distributed. So when you talk about the single category features, you can distinguish 3 kind of distribution. Here we show there's a possibility of either clustered or uniform or random distribution. Clustered distribution means that the features tend to occur in the space that they're next to each other more often. So things form clusters in that sense. And the uniform distribution means features are less likely to occur in the close proximity of each other. While random distribution is a pattern that the features equally likely to be at any location. Although we can roughly classify these 3 patterns, but please remember that these patterns tend to change with the scale of the map. So in broader scale, you may look like a random distribution, but if you look at the large scale, the localities, you may see some clusters and here and there. Also, it could have spatially heterogeneous. That means if you're looking at a big area, you may find maybe that the northeastern area showing a more clustered distribution, but the southwest area may turn out to be a uniform or random distribution. So that's all possible. We call this phenomenon as spatial heterogeneity, reveal that the cause of those patterns may be different from place to place. The other kind of interpretation of map pattern is to focus on the relationships, especially if your question concerns how features of one type are located in connection with other types. For example, the map at the bottom shows different kind of businesses and offices location as points. And if you look at this multiple types of business and offices, it seems that there's a few types that are likely to happen near or close to the street network. For example, retail stores, financial offices, and other kind of service business tend to be located along the streets. This is for the convenience of the customers. In contrast, those offices about the government agencies, construction companies, and manufacturers, they do not necessarily being close to a street. That's kind of match well to the knowledge we have. One of the important steps of visual analytics is to use our mental schema, mental knowledge, to guide our interpretation. Okay? When people observe some interesting pattern, it's very natural for them to pursue the answers or explanations. One of the ways to find out why the pattern occur is to associate these patterns with potential causing factors. For example, the forest vegetation are likely to be correlated with elevation of the landscape. So one of the way to understand why certain vegetation type happens in certain area is to overlay the digital elevation model with the vegetation type, which could possibly explain the reason. For example, the map we show here as a pair that find that the digital elevation model on the right explain very well to the vegetation type on the left. Another way to think about interpretation of a geographical pattern is to follow the general idea of a two-step process. One is to look for patterns that you can expect. For example, given the map at the bottom, it shows the distribution of service stores, cleaners, dry cleaners. And it's pretty natural to see this pattern. We can see that, okay, the dry cleaner stores do not want to be close to each other because they want to compete. They want to have the share of market in the neighborhood. However, we do see there's two dry cleaner stores are very, very close to each other, which is exception, is a surprise. So in this natural process, what we need to really pay attention to, what are the outliers, what are the surprises, what is the unexpected pattern that we cannot explain, and then that will drive us to collect more data and find out why these two stores actually so much close to each other. You may find out that the reason the two dry cleaner stores are so close may be because there's a huge amount of demand that wouldn't be met by one store. Maybe a very large business complex or residential complex, or they're just maybe concentrated residents or kind of rental homes, rental houses.